The American woman is doing the same thing as the Arabian man is doing. The Arabian man is telling their women to cover up with cloaks to hide their bodies from male eyes, because it's nothing more but a fact that the male gender is actually sexually attracted physically to the female gender. Where it's like, we go and we physically see that the female gender is physically, sexually attractive, and then it's a dopamine hit from the sex center of our brains, through our nervous system, to our dick. But the female gender's version of a sexual thought, in terms of how they're wired to have a sexual fantasy, is to feel sexually attracted to the fact that the male gender is sexually attracted to them. And so they have an egotistical power trip to think in their brains that what men should have is the incapability of resisting them, and from that female gender's version of a sexual thought, of a sexual fantasy, comes a dopamine hit from their sex center in their brain through their nervous system to their vagina. And so the female gender is basically illegalizing what turns them on in terms of how they're wired to become turned on. They're telling men to not approach. They're telling men to not catcall. They're telling men to not give women their validation, self-esteem, and ego boost to allow for them to feel desired. Because the Arabian man knows, just like all other men existing on planet the fuck Earth, that what they're going to do is every time they have a sexual thought from looking at the female gender's body, that they lose energy to prevent themselves from being able to work on their goals, conquests, and hobbies. And it's the same thing with the female gender, except the egotistical power trip validation and self-esteem boosts to allow for them to think that what they have is their thumb directly over men's heads, and all they have to do is to push directly down on top of it. That's the female gender's version of the sexual thought. That makes them lose energy to prevent themselves from being able to have the energy to go and make money in order to be able to form themselves as boss bitches, so that they can think of themselves as unattainable to mankind, and that mankind can't have them, which is the higher nature's female power trip, to think of themselves as unattainable, or whatever the fuck the female gender thought out of complete delusion, that what we as the male gender should be is any kind of an amount of desperate to obtain. Because what we as the male gender are supposed to do is to stand there and take that shit. So that's the big secret. That's what the female gender is trying to hide about how their dark nature works. And that's the reason why they're telling men to not approach, to not give them their validation, self-esteem, and ego boost, to allow for them to feel desired. All the way to the point where we physically see that some females will go and cut their hair off. And the reason why they do this is because it thinks that it will help stop men giving them their complimentation and self-esteem and ego and slick talk, talking about they're cute, they have a fat ass. They think that what it will do is to help prevent that, so that they don't have their female gender's version of a sexual thought that makes them lose energy, for them to be able to morph themselves into independent boss bitches. They don't want men to exploit this. But it's happening, though. You have Chad and Tyrone that make the egotistical power trip and validation that mankind has to give to women as power over actually feeling sexually attracted physically to the opposite gender. And they're good at this because they've been working all their lives mastering this ability for themselves. And they basically use their ego of saying that they have game with women to hide, to basically hide their disappointment about the female gender not feeling sexually attracted physically to us back. That's what Chad and Tyrone's doing. They're like, well, the female gender's not wired to feel sexually attracted physically. Well, I can at least have my dopamine hit that I have game with women. I can get whatever vagina I want. I can, get a woman to pay for my living expenses and lavish lifestyle by having her work 3 jobs for me. Okay, maybe not lavish lifestyle, but the living expenses in order for him to be able to live off women. It happens. And the reason why it happens is because Chad and Tyrone, they work the woman's nervous system, and the woman is willing to go and pay for this dopamine hit that they're wired to have from the sex center of their brain. That's the reason why the female gender fucks the narcissistic man rather than the nice, safe, secure guy. The nice, safe, secure guy rejects the ideology that the female gender is not wired to feel sexually attracted physically to the male gender and avoids women altogether. And they're like, I'm not disrespecting myself allowing for you to feel desired. To think in your brain that what you have is your thumb directly over my head and all you have to do is to push directly down on top of it. But going back to the Chad and Tyrone thing of women paying for men's living expenses, sometimes it happens the other way around. It doesn't always happen with the man paying for the woman's living expenses. It happens sometimes where the woman would go and pay for the man's living expenses. Because the man is selling her the dopamine hit of validation. And then, because that's the female gender's version of a sexual thought, it goes through her nervous system to her vagina, and the tension builds up down there. And she wants to fuck the narcissistic guy that has been working his entire life to learn how the female gender sex drive works in terms of how they're turned on, but doesn't want to fuck the nice, safe, secure guy that's been working 3 jobs, and working on himself and abstaining and not allowing for the female gender to feel desired to think in their brains that what men should be is desperate. Because the female gender would rather have their dopamine hit. At least the lower nature female would, but the higher nature female at the current moment is trying to reject that. Because they want to use their own energy to become independent boss bitches, and they're like, screw men and fuck men, and we don't need the men's validation and self-esteem boost, and so they're not as attracted to us. They're not giving us our dopamine hits that make us lose energy, because when you go and you jack yourself off, or you go and you have a sexual thought, your own damn self as a man, us men, we lose energy. It's the same thing for the female in terms of how they have their sexual thought. I'm irresistible. Dopamine hit from the sex center of their brain through the nervous system to their vagina. So that's the big secret. That's the reason why the female gender is not honest about how their dark nature works. Because they don't want mankind exploiting that. They don't want mankind knowing the little secret of women. That you can actually turn allowing for them to feel desired as power over actually feeling sexually attracted physically to the opposite gender. Which proves that men can have power over sex as well, and it's not just women.